Beyond the Flint Water Crisis and the lead that was in the pipes that corroded, you recently wrote another report on lead paint poisoning, specifically in public housing in Chicago, but it's also something that's happening, lead paint's everywhere. And this is really, really scary stuff. So tell us about the report.
Yeah, so Flint obviously shone a bright light on lead poisoning through water, as it should, and the problems with drinking water in Flint are not in any way unique to Flint. But it is also true that, first of all, lead poisoning is still a huge problem in this country. We have known about the dangers of lead at least since the 1950s and banned its use in multiple products in the 70s and 80s. And yet we still have about 500,000 children in this country who have high levels of lead in their blood. Most of that is coming from lead paint chips, lead paint dust, things that you find in housing. And what's very troubling is that we have rules that are supposed to be preventing this and keeping people from getting poisoned in the first place, and they're just really not doing enough. A lot of people are falling through the cracks. So what I wrote about was the rules that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has in place to protect people who are in publicly funded housing. So that means someone who has a voucher to help them pay for rent, they're protected under these rules. Someone who lives in a public housing unit, all that sort of public money that goes to help people have housing. There are just these holes in the rules. HUD uses outdated measurements of what constitutes lead poisoning. Like I said, the CDC says there's no safe level of lead, but at the very least, if there's 5 micrograms per deciliter in a child's blood, that is cause for concern, that is cause for action. HUD doesn't take action until that level gets up to either 15 or 20, depending on how you're doing the testing.
Wow.
So people find out that their children have, let's say 5 micrograms, 7 micrograms in their blood, and then they're sort of stuck in these houses without being able to move, without being able to ask the landlord to do something about it because it doesn't meet that higher threshold that HUD uses. I will say that the agency is trying right now to change that. Secretary Castro has put in a request to change the rule and update its own measurements so that they are in line with current science and the CDC. We'll see sort of how quickly that can move through. But there's other problems too. I mean, at the point at which we're testing kids and taking action, it's basically too late. What we need to really be doing is making sure that the poisoning doesn't happen in the first place, because lead poisoning is irreparable and irreversible. The inspections that HUD uses in a lot of housing are visual inspections, and they're just very loose. Basically, what it consists of, if you and I, if we wanted to, could become certified inspectors, you go online, you click through a series of slides with text and pictures, then you're certified, and then you go into a housing unit and you look for peeling paint. And peeling paint is probably the biggest hazard. If it's a house that was painted before we banned lead in paint and it's peeling, that is definitely going to be a big problem, but it's not the only problem. What it misses is if there's lead dust, if the paint is turning into dust. Windows and doors are a big hazard because, paint at the joints is particularly vulnerable to cracking and peeling and turning to dust. There are better inspections out there that would take samples of the dust, that would take samples of soil and would analyze them and actually make sure that there is no lead in the housing. But it's more expensive, so we don't mandate it. It's something that HUD is looking into again, but it would probably need Congress to act, and we know how likely that is. All of which is to say, we know what causes lead poisoning. We also know how to prevent it from happening, and yet it is still happening, and it is so damaging to children and their lives. It's just heartbreaking. I spoke to parents in Chicago in public housing whose children were poisoned by their homes, and they're just devastated. And there's really nothing much, there are things you can do to try and mitigate it, but there is nothing we can do to make it go away. So we just need to be doing more when it comes to lead prevention.
Yeah, it's I mean, I don't know. I think it's the fact that we know, right? The fact that we know that it exists, we know that how it's happening, and we're not doing anything about it. That to me is criminal. It's like we are literally poisoning people when we could, just for, lack of want and lack of initiative, and actually, having the desire to not have our citizenry poisoned. The fact that that's not happening is in my opinion, just flat out criminal. That it's just a matter of like money. Why not? Why isn't there some giant initiative to go and like train a bunch of train thousands of workers to go and take care of this problem? But it's obviously that's with a right wing Congress, that's not something that's happened. But this is something that's been around for a while. So this is something that's up until recently not gotten a whole lot of national attention. The whole idea of lead poisoning. But the fact that there should be a political demand to stop poisoning the citizens of the United States. That doesn't seem that that's something that's out of the realm of rational thought and decency that we should be asking for here,
Yeah, and there used to be, I think, a lot more national urgency. There used to be a presidential task force that was all about this. The task force has since been disbanded. I just think this issue has been swept under the rug a bit until I hope now with Flint, bringing this to national attention, I'm hoping that tide has turned. But I think with the really depressing reasoning I have and many people have for the reason this has gotten swept under the rug is because the people who are most impacted by lead poisoning and by, crumbling housing, substandard water systems, they are mostly poor and they are mostly people of color. And so, if this was an epidemic that was afflicting rich white children, I don't think we would have such slow action and so many people dragging their feet. I think it would be a national crisis. But because of the people that it impacts, I think it's just this slow-moving emergency that we don't want to deal with. It also, of course, costs money up front to do these things, but the research is really robust that spending money on this kind of thing, eradicating lead hazard, keeping children from being poisoned, pays enormous dividends in the end because you are basically saving them from being poisoned.
Right, exactly, and all the consequences of the poison.
Yeah, I mean, it's just they're able to live productive, healthy, happy lives, and if we don't do it, they are not. So on the moral issue, on the fiscal issue, I do think it is outrageous that we don't take more action and just get rid of this problem. I guess I'm just hopeful that now is perhaps the time that we will.